Well, here at WKYT News, we have covered a variety of stories involving road and pedestrian safety, specifically a lot of times around the Euclid Avenue area of Lexington.
We do get a lot of complaints, and in today's good question, Nicole asks, in front of the Euclid Kroger, everyone stops when someone hits that button to initiate the flashing crosswalks. But in front of Lansdowne Elementary School, no one stops. Those lights are flashing, but 99% of the vehicles just don't stop. Well, should they? Here's Victor Puente with the answer to that good question.
That flashing light over the crosswalk is not a suggestion. Those drivers should definitely be stopping. And the fact that it's happening in front of an elementary school is even worse. We've covered crossing guards saving children from being hit by cars. We even covered a guard who was killed after they were hit. In Kentucky, drivers are required to stop as long as the pedestrian has the right of way. In general, at crosswalks, pedestrians have the right of way unless there's a traffic control device telling them not to cross. Pedestrians are expected to follow those, and drivers are expected to stop and wait for the pedestrian to cross. State law says when traffic control signals are not in place or in operation, the operator of the vehicle shall yield the right of way, slowing down or stopping if need be to so yield to a pedestrian crossing the roadway upon which the vehicle is traveling, or when the pedestrian is approaching so closely from the opposite half of the roadway as to be in danger. However, if that pedestrian is somewhere other than a crosswalk or intersection, state law says that they should yield to vehicles on the road. It's also important for pedestrians to keep in mind that just because a driver is supposed to stop doesn't mean they will. So pedestrians need to be aware of their surroundings. If you have a good question, email us. Goodquestion@WKYT.com. I'll see you on WKYT Mornings.